Midnight horror stories. These are the stories people tell quietly, late at night, to the one person they trust. Tonight, you're that person. Turn off the lights.
The ridgerunner. I walked the Appalachian Trail professionally for 6 seasons. I want to tell you what walks it too. Before I describe what I encountered, let me explain what a ridgerunner actually is, because the title gets used loosely and the specifics matter for understanding why I was in the position I was in and why the things I'm about to describe happened to me rather than to ordinary thru-hikers passing through. A ridgerunner is a paid, seasonal employee of an Appalachian Trail Conservancy partner organization. In my case, the managing club responsible for a specific section of the trail in the Central Appalachians. The job is to walk an assigned section of the trail repeatedly throughout the season, checking on hiker welfare, educating about leave no trace principles, reporting trail conditions, and serving as the eyes and ears of the managing club in terrain that can go days or weeks without a management visit. You live in the field, in trail shelters, or a small base camp, for stretches of 5 to 10 days at a time. You walk your section, which in my case was a 38-mile stretch in a remote part of the Central Appalachians, from one end to the other and back again, multiple times across the spring to fall season. By the end of 6 seasons, I had walked that specific 38 miles more times than I could accurately count. The distinction between a ridgerunner and a thru-hiker matters for the following reason. A thru-hiker passes through a section once, usually moving at 2 to 4 miles per hour, focused on their own progress. They see the trail in one direction, in one season, once. I walked mine in both directions, in every season from late April through early November, in every weather condition, at every hour, and I came back to do it again the following year. What I know about that 38 miles is not the knowledge of a visitor. It is the knowledge of a person who has spent more time in that specific piece of terrain than anyone else in the modern history of the trail's management in that section, including the long-term volunteers who'd been maintaining it for decades. I say this not to establish authority, but to establish context. Whatever I'm about to describe was not a misread of unfamiliar terrain. I knew that terrain. I knew every shelter, every water source, every ridgeline and hollow and side trail. I knew the wildlife that used it, the timing of their seasonal movements, the specific sounds the different sections of that trail produced in different weather. I knew it the way a fisherman knows a river he's worked for 20 years, by feel as much as by memory, with a precision and a completeness that comes only from repeated, sustained, attentive presence. The Appalachian Trail, for people who haven't spent serious time on it, is not a single thing. It's not a consistent experience from end to end. Its character changes dramatically across its 2,200 miles, from the rocky, exposed ridgelines of the Northeast to the dense, humid hollows of the Southern Appalachians, and every section has its own ecology, its own terrain profile, its own specific community of regular users. The section I worked was in the central part of the range. I'm going to be deliberately vague about the precise location for reasons I'll explain as I go, and it had several characteristics that made it distinct from more popular sections of the trail. The terrain was rougher than most its sections. The shelters were widely spaced, and the hiking between them was genuinely demanding, which meant the section drew a more experienced population of hikers than the sections with amenity-heavy shelters and gentler grades. The road crossings were infrequent, and the longest stretch without a road crossing was close to 12 miles, which meant that if something happened to you in the middle of it, help was a long way off in any direction. It was also, by the standards of the Central Appalachians, genuinely remote. Not Alaskan remote, not northern Minnesota remote, but remote in the particular way that the Appalachians achieve it, Through the density of the terrain and the depth of the hollows and the thickness of the forest, a remoteness that has a different character from western wilderness remoteness, but that is, in its own way, complete. The ridgelines in my section were above 3,000 feet, and the hollows below them were 1,500 feet, with forest in between that in the right light and the right weather had a quality to it. Heavy, dark, close, that even after 6 seasons I never stopped noticing. Old forest, mixed hardwood and hemlock below, oak and hickory on the upper slopes, a few surviving American beech in the hollows that hadn't yet been killed by the blight. Trees that had been growing in those hollows for 200 years in some cases, old enough to have been there before the trail was cut through, old enough that the trail was the newcomer in the relationship. I started the job in my late 20s. I'd been working seasonal outdoor jobs since college, trail crew, wilderness therapy, a season as a backcountry ranger, and the ridgerunner position was the one I'd been building toward, the one that combined the elements I most valued: sustained, deep, professional engagement with a specific piece of wild landscape. I took to it immediately, the way you take to a job that turns out to fit you better than you expected, and by the end of my first season, I was already thinking about how to extend my time in the section. The first thing happened at the end of my first season, October, 2 weeks before the seasonal employment ended. I was doing my last northbound traverse of the section for the year, a 3-day walk from south to north with overnight stops at 2 of the shelters. The weather had been unusual for that time of year, warmer than average with a high-pressure system that kept the skies clear and the humidity down, a late-season gift that made the leaf color exceptional and the hiking pleasant in a way that early October in those mountains isn't always. I was 2 days in, at the midsection shelter, a log structure set back about 60 feet from the trail in a hollow below a ridgeline, with a small creek nearby and a good spring for water. I'd had the shelter to myself for 2 nights, which was unusual even in early October when hiker traffic drops off but doesn't vanish entirely. In 6 years of working that section, I could count on one hand the number of times I'd gone back-to-back nights with no other trail users at a shelter, and having it happen at the mid-section shelter twice in a row registered faintly as something worth noting. On the 3rd night at that shelter, I'd extended my stay by a day to do some maintenance work on a nearby water bar. I woke up around 2 in the morning to complete silence. This sounds unremarkable, but isn't. In a forest with a creek running 40 feet from the shelter and the normal background sound of whatever moves at night in that kind of terrain, which in those mountains includes owls, coyotes, various small mammals, and occasionally deer or black bear. The complete silence had a quality I've described before when I've told pieces of this story, a pressure to it, a held quality that is different from simple quiet. Quiet is the absence of sound. What I experienced in that shelter at 2 in the morning was the suppression of sound, the forest having made a decision about whether to produce its ordinary noise and having come down on the side of no. I lay still and listened. Whatever had produced the silence didn't resolve into a sound for a long time. Then, from somewhere on the ridge above the shelter, maybe 200 yards upslope, I heard something that I want to describe carefully. The sound was a voice. Not clearly, not the kind of clarity that would let you transcribe words, or even determine a language. But the fundamental phonemic structure of human speech, the rhythm and intonation pattern that identifies sound as vocal and intentional, was unmistakably present. One voice, speaking or chanting. The monotone quality could be read either way, in a low, consistent pitch, in a rhythm that had a regularity to it that suggested repetition rather than flowing speech. Not getting closer, not fading, staying at approximately the same distance from the shelter for close to 5 minutes, and then simply stopping. I didn't go up the ridge. It was 2 in the morning, the slope above the shelter was steep and rocky, and whatever was up there had stopped, and the forest slowly resumed its ordinary sound after another few minutes, and the night became unremarkable again. I wrote it in my field journal. I considered the available explanations: a hiker camping off-trail above the shelter, perhaps doing something meditative or spiritual in the private space of a backcountry night, which does happen, and I filed it without committing to anything and went back to sleep. The same sound came from the same direction the following night. Same timing, close to 2 in the morning. Same pitch, same rhythm, same duration of approximately 5 minutes. Same location on the ridge above the shelter. Same complete cessation at the end that didn't fade but stopped, the way a tape stops rather than the way a voice naturally trails. I went up the ridge the second morning before I broke camp. The slope above the shelter was mixed hardwood, open enough to walk through without much difficulty once you got above the rhododendron band at the lower elevation. I spent about 40 minutes working through the area above the shelter where the sound had been coming from. I found nothing. No signs of camping, no fire ring, no compressed vegetation, no trampled soil, none of the evidence that a human being spending 2 nights in one place in that terrain would produce. There was a rocky outcrop on the ridge crest about 230 yards above the shelter, exactly where I would have placed the source of the sound based on its apparent distance and direction, and the outcrop showed nothing. I noted it in the field journal as unexplained auditory phenomenon, source undetermined, and left the shelter for my final northbound push. I completed the section 2 days later and drove home and started the off-season and didn't mention it to my supervising organization because there was nothing useful to report. In the off-season, I did something that I'd been meaning to do and hadn't gotten around to. I requested access to the section's historical records from the managing club, the accumulated documentation of decades of trail maintenance and management decisions. What I was looking for was nothing specific. I just wanted the fuller picture of the section's history that a single season hadn't given me. What I found, among the maintenance logs and the shelter register notes and the vegetation surveys, was a file that the club's historian had assembled, labeled only with the section name and the date range it covered. The file contained, among other things, a collection of unusual incident reports going back to the 1970s, when the section had come under the managing club's care. These were filed under the standard incident report categories: medical emergencies, search and rescue operations, equipment damage. But there was a subcategory that I hadn't seen in any other management documentation I'd worked with, labeled simply as unexplained. The unexplained subcategory had 17 entries spanning 40 years. I read all 17. I'm going to describe the pattern rather than the individual entries, because the pattern is what matters. 14 of the 17 entries described sounds, voices, in the most common formulation, heard from ridgelines above the trail or above shelters, at night, in the same general rhythm and monotone quality I described in my own notes. 3 entries described visual encounters, shapes seen at trail's edge at night, at a distance, that didn't resolve into anything identifiable when the observer reached the location. The entries were spread across the 40-year span with no clustering around any particular period, suggesting not a single wave of incidents, but a consistent, background-level pattern of occurrence across the full history of the club's management of that section. The most recent entry was from 12 years before my hire. It read, in its entirety, camp host at midsection shelter reported hearing repetitive vocal sound from ridge above shelter on 3 consecutive nights. Investigated following morning, no source found, no evidence of off-trail camping. Camp host declined to return for remainder of assignment. The midsection shelter, 3 consecutive nights. I'd had 2 nights. The camp host had been there a full night longer than I had and had declined to return. I went back for my second season. I'm going to be honest about why. Not because I'd resolved anything from the first season, but because the job was the job I wanted and the history I'd found in the club's files had produced in me the same compulsive need to understand that I think drives most people who stay in this kind of work past the point where a sensible person would step back. You find something you can't explain, and instead of running from it, you want to go back and look at it again from a slightly different angle. See if the new angle produces more. That's a personality type. I have it. The 6 seasons I worked that section are partly a product of it. The second season was quieter than the first. I had the 2-night sound event at the midsection shelter and nothing else from the first season to compare it to, and the second season produced no equivalent incident. What it produced instead was something subtler and harder to describe, which was a gradual, growing awareness of the behavior of the wildlife in the section in a way that I hadn't been paying close enough attention to in year 1. Specifically, what I noticed in year 2 was the deer. The Appalachian Trail in the central Appalachians runs through healthy white-tailed deer habitat, and trail users see deer regularly. I had a day-to-day familiarity with the deer in my section that most at-workers don't develop because they don't stay long enough. I knew which areas held the highest concentrations, which time of day produced the most activity, the rough demographic breakdown of the population in different parts of the section by body size and behavior. Normal, healthy deer population in good habitat, behaving the way deer in good habitat behave. Except in one stretch of the section. There is a 12-mile stretch in the northern third of my section, the stretch without a road crossing, that passes through a specific terrain type, a long, narrow ridgeline with steep drops on both sides, hemlock-dominated, with a series of rocky outcrops at the highest points before the ridge descends back toward the valley. In 6 years of walking that stretch, I can count on 2 hands the number of times I saw deer in it, which over 6 seasons of multiple traverses works out to a rate of deer observation dramatically lower than any other comparable section of trail in my area. The habitat looked fine. The forage looked fine. There was no obvious reason for the deer population to use that 12-mile stretch less than they used the terrain on either side of it. But they didn't use it. Not consistently, not predictably. Deer would be present right up to an invisible line that corresponded roughly to where the hemlock density increased at the lower north end of the ridge, and then you'd walk 12 miles with almost no deer sign, and then you'd come out the other side and find deer again. The same pattern held on the south approach. Something about that 12-mile stretch of hemlock ridge, in a section of trail where everything else looked like ideal deer habitat, was being systematically avoided by the primary large herbivore species in the area. I asked about this, carefully, to one of the long-term trail maintainers, a man named Phil who'd been working that section for close to 20 years and who knew its ecology as well as anyone. I asked about the deer distribution, whether he'd noticed the gap. He was quiet for a moment and then said, yes, he'd noticed it, and that it had been that way for as long as he'd been working the section. He didn't offer an explanation. I asked if anyone had ever investigated it. He said not that he was aware of. I asked what he thought was behind it. He said, looking somewhere slightly past my left shoulder rather than directly at me, there are places on this trail that the animals know to avoid. This isn't the only one. If you work the trail long enough, you find them. He said it in the same tone I'd heard other experienced outdoor professionals use for things they'd observed, integrated, and decided not to examine further. He changed the subject. Year 3 is when the encounters became something I couldn't file under unexplained auditory phenomenon and leave. It was early June, the beginning of the thru-hiker bubble, the period when the northbound hikers who started in Georgia in late February or March hit the central Appalachians in large numbers, and the shelters fill up, and the trail has a different energy. I was doing a southbound traverse, moving from the north end of my section toward the south, and I was crossing the 12-mile ridgeline section in the early afternoon, which was when I typically try to cross it, not because I consciously decided to avoid it after dark, but because the timing of my traversal pattern tended to put me there in daylight. At the highest point of the ridge, a rocky outcrop with a 270-degree view that was one of the best viewpoints in the entire section, I stopped for lunch and sat on the rocks for close to 45 minutes, eating and enjoying the view and watching what was happening in the valley below, which in June was green and deep and beautiful. I'd done this dozens of times at that specific rock. It was one of my regular stopping points. While I was sitting there, I became aware that something was watching me from the hemlock stand on the slope below the outcrop to the east. I want to describe this awareness precisely because it matters how it arrived. It was not a sound. Nothing had changed in the audio landscape of that ridge at midday, which was dominated by wind and distant ravens and my own presence. It was not a movement I'd caught in my peripheral vision, because I'd been looking north and the hemlock stand was to the east, and I hadn't been looking that direction. It was an awareness that arrived without any specific sensory trigger, the pre-conscious recognition that something in the environment had changed in a way that my nervous system had registered before my attention had caught up to it. I turned and looked at the hemlock stand. At the upper edge of the hemlocks, where the trees met the rocky open ground of the upper ridge, there was a shape. Standing, upright. In the shadow of the hemlock canopy where the light didn't reach well at that angle, on a slope that was rocky and steep and that I knew well enough to know was not terrain that most people would choose to stand on casually. The shape was human in its vertical orientation and completely wrong in almost every other specific quality I could observe from the 60 or 70 yards between me and it. The height was wrong, too tall, taller than any person I've encountered in 6 years of meeting trail users of every size and build. The arms were wrong. I could see the arms clearly enough to know that their length relative to the torso was not right in a way that I can describe, but can't adequately convey in words. Simply the proportion of limb to body that no human being has, and that every human being would recognize as wrong from this distance if they were looking at it. And the stillness was wrong, in the specific way that I described before in other contexts. The stillness of something that is not holding itself still as a behavior, but that is simply still as a condition, the way a tree is still, the way a rock is still. I looked at it for perhaps 10 seconds before it moved back into the hemlock canopy and was no longer visible. Not running, not fleeing, moving with the same deliberate, unhurried quality of everything else I've described in this account, stepping backward into the shadow of the hemlocks and being gone in the way that something goes when it has decided to leave rather than when it has been startled into leaving. I sat on that rock for a long time after it was gone. The view was still the same view. The sky was the same sky. The ravens that had been working the thermals off the ridge were still working them. Everything about the landscape was entirely continuous with what it had been before I turned and saw what I saw, and the continuity of the ordinary world on either side of that 10-second observation was, in a strange way, as hard to process as the observation itself. I went down into the hemlock stand before I continued my traverse. I spent about 20 minutes moving through the area where the shape had been standing. The slope was steep and rocky, as I'd known, and the ground between the rocks was soft enough in places to hold an impression. I found no impression. The hemlock duff, which is dense and compressible and holds marks from anything standing in it, showed nothing in the area I searched. I walked south for the rest of that day without seeing anything unusual. I camped alone that night at the south shelter and lay in my sleeping bag for a long time before I slept, going over what I'd seen in the same methodical way I'd always processed field observations, running through every possible alternative explanation and testing each one against the specific details of what I'd actually observed. The most persistent alternative was a hiker, off-trail on the steep rocky slope below the outcrop. But hikers don't go to that slope. There's no reason to. It's steep, loose, and leads nowhere interesting, with the trail itself providing the best access to the views from the ridge. And the proportions were wrong in ways that a hiker in unusual clothing or an unusual stance doesn't account for. And it was still in a way that a hiker standing on a steep rocky slope trying not to fall doesn't achieve. And there was no compression in the hemlock duff. Year 3 was also the year I started asking, carefully and obliquely, the people I trusted on the trail. There is a network of knowledge that exists among the longtime volunteer trail maintainers of the Appalachian Trail that never makes it into any formal publication or training document. It's the knowledge that accumulates when the same people walk the same miles of trail for decades, the knowledge of what those miles actually contain beyond the official trail register and the shelter log, the knowledge of incidents and patterns and places that the organization handles on a need-to-know basis or doesn't handle at all. I'd been in the system long enough to have some access to that network, and in year 3, I started using it. What I found, over the course of careful conversations spread across years 3 and 4, was that the specific section I worked had a reputation that extended back through the institutional memory of the managing club to before anyone in the current volunteer leadership had begun working there. The midsection shelter's history with the unexplained vocal sounds was known, not widely, but specifically, by 3 or 4 of the most senior volunteers. The 12-mile ridgeline's avoidance by deer was known to Phil and 2 others, who had similar observations from their own long-term work on the section. And the shape on the Hemlock Ridge, or something like it, described with varying levels of specificity and confidence, had come up in the accounts of 2 other field staff and 1 long-term trail maintainer across a period spanning more than 15 years of the section's management history. One of the other ridgerunners who'd worked that section before me, a woman named Vera who'd done 2 seasons in the late 2000s and who I tracked down through the club's alumni records and reached out to cold, agreed to talk with me when I explained what I was looking into. She'd had her own encounter, which she described as a visual observation from a trail shelter at night of something moving along the ridgeline above the shelter, something she'd characterized at the time, in her own field notes, as possibly a person moving at an unusual height and speed for the terrain. She'd never reported it formally. She told me she'd left the ridgerunner position at the end of her 2nd season and had not applied for a 3rd, giving reasons she acknowledged were not entirely honest, the real reason being that she'd become uncomfortable enough with what she'd experienced in that section to want to work somewhere else. Vera said one thing in our conversation that I've thought about across the years since. She said, "There are sections of the where the experienced people know not to be alone at night. This section is one of them. I don't know if that's based on what I experienced or on something older that people know without it being said directly. But it's real. The people who've worked that section know. The people who've worked that section know. I was becoming one of those people." Year 4 was the year of the animal behavior change, which was the thing that reorganized everything else for me in the way that a new piece of evidence reorganizes a picture you thought you understood. I'd noticed the deer avoidance in year 2 and noted it, and continued to think of it as a discrete, localized phenomenon on the 12-mile ridge. What I noticed in year 4, walking the section for a 4th season with the accumulated attention of 4 years of close observation, was that the avoidance pattern was not limited to deer, and was not limited to the 12-mile ridge. It extended, subtly, not completely, not with sharp boundaries, but it extended from the 12-mile Hemlock Ridge into the northern third of my section generally, and the wildlife that showed it was not only deer. The bird populations in the northern third were different from the bird populations in the central and southern thirds, not absent, but quieter, less species diverse, with fewer of the species that are most sensitive to disturbance. The coyotes that I heard regularly throughout the central and southern sections fell largely silent when I was in the northern third, the long-distance vocalizations that are the most reliable indicator of where a coyote pack is working a territory going quiet across the full span of the north section in a way that didn't match the terrain or the prey density. The black bears were the most striking. Bear activity on the in the central Appalachians is a genuine management issue. The food-conditioned bears that have learned to raid packs and coolers and shelters are a significant concern, and in 6 seasons, I dealt with bear management at most of the shelters in my section. Except the shelter in the northern third. In 6 seasons of work, I had exactly 0 bear incidents at the northern shelter, despite the shelter's food-hanging infrastructure being older and less adequate than several of the shelters in the other parts of the section where I regularly dealt with bear activity. The bears that actively worked the central and southern shelters did not appear to work the northern one. In 6 years, I raised the northern shelter's bear activity record with the club in year 4, framed as a management question about whether the infrastructure there needed upgrading given the overall increase in bear activity across the section. The response I got from the volunteer who handled the shelter infrastructure was puzzling enough that I remember it clearly. He told me not to worry about the north shelter, that it had never had a problem and wouldn't, and when I asked why he thought that was, he said, with the specific precision of a person who knows more than they're saying, that shelter has good neighbors. Good neighbors, said with the flat, knowing tone of an old Appalachian expression used in its original meaning, which is not what the phrase means in suburban context. In Appalachian tradition, a good neighbor in the woods is something that keeps the dangerous things away, that maintains order in its territory, that the animals around it give a wide berth to not from fear, but from recognition of what it is and what its presence means for the ecological balance of the immediate area. I knew the phrase. I understood what he was telling me without quite saying it. The North Shelter's lack of bear activity was not an absence. It was a presence, something in the northern third of that section that the bears, which are themselves the apex land predator in those mountains, afraid of very little, had decided to give appropriate distance to. Good neighbors. Year 5 was the year of the children. I have been building to this, and I want to tell it as carefully as I've told everything else, because it is the worst thing I experienced on that trail in 6 seasons, and the thing that most directly explains why I left after year 6. It was September, the winding down of the thru-hiker season, when the bubble has passed, and the trail is quieter, and the weather in those mountains starts to produce the first cold nights that push the remaining hikers to think about their finish date. I was doing a northbound traverse, the last full traverse of my 5th season. 2 days into the 3-day walk, I was approaching the northern shelter late in the afternoon, a little later than I usually like to arrive at a shelter because a water problem at a creek earlier in the day had cost me close to an hour. When I came into the shelter clearing, there was a man already there. A day hiker, he said, out from the road crossing at the south end of the no-crossing stretch, doing the northern section as an out and back. He was packing up to leave, had already done his turnaround, and was heading back south as I was coming in north. We talked for a few minutes in the way trail people talk, comparing notes on conditions, and he asked whether I'd seen the kids on the trail. I said I hadn't, and asked what he meant. He said there were 2 children walking north on the trail, he'd seen them about 3 miles south, alone, no adults visible, which had struck him as unusual enough to mention. He said they'd looked lost or confused. He'd asked if they were okay, and they hadn't answered, just stood on the trail looking at him, and he'd moved on because there was nothing else he could do, and he'd assumed their parents were somewhere nearby. I noted it and told him I'd keep an eye out as I moved south the following day. He left heading south, and I set up at the shelter and ate and prepared for the night. And in the back of my mind, I was running the calculation that ridgerunners always run when there's a potential welfare situation on the trail. If 2 children came north to where he'd seen them and kept going north, they might reach the shelter by dark or they might not, depending on their pace and whether they were actually moving north or had turned around. If they reached the shelter, I'd know about it. If they didn't, I should probably start moving south when I had enough light to do so safely. Nobody reached the shelter that night. I stayed up past my usual hour, watching the South Trail entrance to the shelter clearing, and at 11 I gave it up and went to sleep, and nothing unusual happened. In the morning I started south early, as soon as there was enough light to move efficiently on the trail, moving faster than my usual pace, looking for any sign of 2 children who might have gotten lost or camped somewhere without shelter in the night. I covered the 3 miles south to where the day hiker had said he'd seen them in about 50 minutes, and I found nothing. No evidence of children on the trail, no small footprints in the soft ground near a wet section, no discarded wrappers, no sign at all that anyone had been there. I walked all the way to the road crossing, the full south end of the no-crossing stretch, and found nothing. No car in the small trailhead parking area with an anxious family waiting. No sign of children or any disturbance that would indicate 2 unaccompanied minors having been in that section. I called the trail club when I reached the road crossing on my satellite communicator and reported what the day hiker had told me. The club checked with local authorities, who checked with county emergency management, and the result was what I'd been afraid of. No missing children report in that county or adjacent counties. No family reporting unaccounted for children in the area. I drove to find the day hiker, who'd signed the trail register at the south end of the no-crossing stretch, and tracked him down through the contact information in the register. He confirmed everything he'd told me. 2 children, standing on the trail, not responding to his question. He described them as between 7 and 10 years old, wearing what he thought were light-colored clothes. When I told him there was no missing person report and no evidence of them in either direction, he was quiet for a long moment and then said, carefully, "I know what I saw." I told him I believed him. I do believe him. And I believe him because of something I have not told you yet, which is that in year 3, before the year 5 child incident, I had had my own version of the same experience. In year 3, on a different traverse, I had seen a figure on the trail ahead of me, at a distance of perhaps 300 yards, on a straight section where 300 yards of clear sightline was possible. A small figure, human-proportioned, moving slowly north, that I had assumed was a young hiker, young in the sense of small, possibly a child, and that I'd made note to check on when I reached them, which given my pace relative to theirs should have taken me perhaps 15 minutes. I did not reach them, not because they moved faster, not because they took a side trail or left the main trail in any direction I could identify. I walked 300 yards on a section of trail with no turnoffs, moving faster than the figure had been moving when I first saw it, and I found nothing. No hiker, no boot prints in a wet section of trail that would have shown tracks from anyone on the trail in the previous several hours. Nothing. I had filed it as a perceptual error, a trail marker or a blaze on a tree at distance reading as a figure in the specific light conditions of that afternoon, and I had not reported it and had not put it in my field journal. Now, in year 5, with the day hiker's report and the absence of any trace, I revisited that earlier observation and I understood that what he had seen and what I had seen were the same thing. Or the same kind of thing. Figures on the trail that do not respond when addressed, that cannot be reached when pursued, that leave no trace in terrain that should record passage. The voice from the ridge. The shape on the hemlock slope. The 12-mile avoidance zone. The good neighbors at the north shelter. And now, across 2 seasons, figures on the trail that were there and then were not there, in the specific ambiguous scale of children, small and light-colored and not answering when spoken to. I sat with that for the rest of year 5 and through the off-season and into year 6. I had 6 seasons of accumulated observations now, my own and the historical records and the accounts I'd gathered from Vera and Phil and the infrastructure volunteer and the accounts in the club's historical files, and I was assembling them into a picture the way you assemble any picture from pieces that have been arriving over a long period. The picture I was assembling was one I'd been resisting for 6 years, not because I was afraid of it, but because committing to it meant committing to a version of what that section of trail was that was very different from the version I'd been given, and that was very different from what most people who walked through it understood themselves to be walking through. What I came to in year 6, sitting with the full accumulated weight of everything I've described, was this: that 38-mile section of trail passes through territory that is inhabited by something that has been there for a very long time, long enough to have established a presence so complete that the local wildlife has calibrated around it across generations, long enough to have worked its way into the oral tradition of the Appalachian communities adjacent to that section as something known and named, and given the wary respect of things that have been known and named in a specific landscape for a very long time. And that the Appalachian Trail, which runs straight through the middle of that territory, puts a continuous stream of human beings through that space, most of them passing through quickly and never understanding what they're moving through, a few of them slower and more attentive and building up a different picture of what they're in. The ridgerunners and the long-term maintainers, the people who stay long enough to understand. We're the ones who see it, and we mostly don't say anything, because what we're describing doesn't fit into the professional language of trail management and doesn't fit into the categories of any wildlife organization or any law enforcement agency, and because the people who know about it have, across decades of institutional memory, settled into the same accommodation that I think every long-term inhabitant of that territory eventually reaches. Give it the respect it's owed. Don't be in the wrong places at the wrong times. Come out of that 12-mile stretch before dark. Year 6 was my last season. I want to tell you why in a way that is accurate and that doesn't lean on drama, because the dramatic account would be dishonest and the honest account is, in its own way, more unsettling. I did not leave because something frightened me in year 6. Year 6 was, by the standard of the 5 seasons before it, relatively quiet. I had 2 incidents of the vocal sound from the ridge in the first half of the season, both at the midsection shelter and both matching the pattern I'd been documenting for 5 years. I had one more visual encounter, this time from the trail itself rather than from a stationary observation point. A shape at the edge of the trail in the 12-mile section in the late afternoon that was visible for perhaps 5 seconds before stepping behind a tree that, when I reached it, I found was significantly smaller in diameter than the shape I'd seen step behind it, which is its own kind of impossible and its own kind of data. I left because of something that happened in the last week of my 6th season that I have never told anyone until now, and that I've been approaching in this account the way you approach something from a long distance before committing to the arrival. I was doing my final northbound traverse of the section, the same traverse I do every October to close out the season. I was on the 12-mile ridge, in the hemlock section, in the late morning, moving north. The weather was cold and clear, The kind of October day in the Appalachians that is the best day the mountains produce. The hardwoods in full color, the air clean and cold, the sky the specific hard blue of high pressure in the fall. Beautiful day, beautiful trail. I'd been in that section on hundreds of days just like it. At the north end of the 12-mile stretch, where the trail comes off the ridge and drops into the hollow before climbing to the north end of my section, there is a large hemlock, one of the biggest in that part of the forest, standing about 20 feet off the east side of the trail. I'd walked past that tree hundreds of times. It's a notable tree, close to 4 feet in diameter at the base, with a crown spread that makes a substantial shadow on the trail in certain light, and I'd always been faintly fond of it the way you're faintly fond of any specific large, old tree that you see regularly over a long period. On this morning, walking north off the ridge, I passed the hemlock, and something made me stop. Not a sound, not a movement. Something that arrived the same way the awareness on the outcrop in year 3 had arrived, preconsciously, before any specific sensory data had been delivered to my conscious attention. I stopped on the trail, and I turned, and I looked at the large hemlock. There was something standing on the far side of it. I could see part of a limb. What I'm going to call a limb because arm isn't quite right for reasons I can't fully articulate, and part of a shoulder or what corresponded to a shoulder, and the edge of what would have been the torso, visible in the gap between the hemlock's root flare and the lower branches. Dark in color, textured in the way I'd come to know over 6 years, not fur exactly, but something with the density and the matted quality that I'd always associated with these observations. The part of it that was visible was still, in the characteristic totality of stillness that I'd documented across 6 seasons. I looked at it for a long time. It did not move. I did not move. The trail was empty in both directions. The hollow below was quiet in the particular way the hollow was quiet when the 12-mile section was in the state it sometimes entered, the suppressed sound state that I'd experienced first at the mid-section shelter in year 1. And then, standing on that trail on a perfect October morning in the 6th year of my work in that section, I understood something that I don't know how to put in language that doesn't sound grandiose, and that I'm going to try to put in language anyway, because it's the most honest account I can give of what happened in that moment. I understood that it knew me, not as an individual. I don't know whether what was behind that hemlock experiences individuality in any sense that maps onto how I understand individuality. What I mean is something simpler and stranger. I understood that whatever had been producing the vocal sounds from the ridgeline and the shapes at the hemlock slope, and the maintained absence of bears at the north shelter, and the deer avoidance on the 12-mile ridge, and the figures on the trail that couldn't be reached, all of it, the full accumulated presence of 6 years of careful observation, had also been accumulating its own observations. Of me, walking that section, 4 traverses a year, both directions, for 6 years. 2,000 miles or more of walking the same 38 miles repeatedly, in the presence of something that, unlike the through hikers who passed through once and moved on, had been there for long enough to watch a person walk the same territory across 6 complete seasons. I had been observed as consistently as I had observed. Whatever had produced everything I'd documented for 6 years had been documenting me, in whatever way it documents the things that move through its territory, with the same attention I'd brought to it, for the same 6 years. I stood on the trail for perhaps 3 minutes. The part of it visible behind the hemlock did not move. Then I continued north, and in the mirror of my mind I watched the trail behind me as I walked, and nothing followed, and I reached the north end of the section in the early afternoon and drove home. I did not apply for a 7th season. I told the club I was moving on to different work, which was true, and that I'd loved the position and the section, which was also true. I didn't tell them what I've told you. What I told them was already the fullest, honest account I was in a position to give, in the professional context of trail management and the institutional relationship I'd built with that club over 6 seasons. What I'm telling you now is the fuller account. 6 seasons. A 38-mile section of the Appalachian Trail in the Central Appalachians. A presence in the northern third of that section that the deer avoid and the bears avoid, and that the long-term volunteers refer to, in their careful, knowing way, as good neighbors. A sound from the ridgeline at night that has been documented in the club's incident records across 40 years of management of that section. Always the same quality, always the same timing, always from the same ridgeline. A series of shapes and figures that leave no trace when approached, but that are visible clearly enough from the right distance that the people who've seen them have no genuine uncertainty about what they saw, only uncertainty about what to call it. I have walked more than 2,000 miles of the Appalachian Trail in my life, across the ridgerunner work and the hiking I did before and after it. The trail in most of its length is exactly what it presents itself as, a path through wild but essentially knowable country, populated by wildlife that is documented and understood, with an ecology that the relevant scientific institutions have characterized with reasonable completeness. That's most of the trail. There are sections where the characterization is less complete, where the institutional knowledge and the oral tradition and the careful observations of the people who stay long enough to accumulate them are pointing at something that the official record doesn't capture, and that the thru-hikers moving through at 3 miles an hour with their eyes on the blazes don't see. Sections where the wildlife distributions have a shape that careful attention reveals as being organized around something that the wildlife management literature doesn't include. Sections where the trail passes through territory that was old before the trail was cut through it, and that is still, in the truest possible sense, not the trail's territory at all. Those sections exist. I worked one for 6 years. If you walk the Appalachian Trail in the Central Appalachians, in the northern section, on the long hemlock ridge where the deer don't go, if you're there in the evening and the birds go quiet and the forest holds its sound rather than releasing it, and from somewhere above the ridge you hear a voice that is organized like language without being language you can understand, repeating in its patient, monotone rhythm in the dark above the trail. Let it finish. Stay where you are. Don't go up the ridge in the dark. And in the morning, when the trail is ordinary again and the birds are back and the deer are present on either side of the section you came through, keep walking. You are moving through something's territory by courtesy. That courtesy has been extended to human beings walking that trail for as long as the trail has run through that section, and the long-term trail workers who know about it have been honoring the terms of it for decades without writing them down, because they don't need to be written down for the people who understand them. Be quiet. Be respectful. Keep moving. I love that trail. I love it still. The beauty of that section is real and it is genuine, and it is worth every mile of the more than 2,000 miles I walked in it. What shares that section with the thru-hikers and the section maintainers and the ridgerunners is also real. It has been there longer than the trail, longer than any of the human activity in those mountains, longer than the documentation of anything in those mountains goes back. It's there tonight, on the Hemlock Ridge, in the particular quality of dark that falls on the Appalachian Trail in the Central Appalachians when the clouds come in from the southwest and the wind drops off the ridge and the trail becomes a very narrow pale line through very old forest in very deep dark. Walk carefully. Come home. I want to go back and fill in the part of this account that I've been moving around, which is the specific history of the Appalachian communities adjacent to that section and what the people who've lived in those mountains their whole lives know about what I've been describing. Because the ridgerunner network and the Trail Club's institutional memory are only two of the knowledge systems that have a record of this, and they're the youngest and the most incomplete. The communities in the valleys below the central Appalachian ridgelines are old communities. Not old in the way that colonial-era settlements are old, where old means a few hundred years. Old in the way that Appalachian mountain communities are old, which is a specific kind of old that includes both the European settlers who came into those hollows in the 18th and 19th centuries and the knowledge they brought with them, and the indigenous peoples who inhabited those mountains for thousands of years before the European arrival, and the specific, syncretic blend of folk knowledge and oral tradition and practical understanding of the landscape that these communities developed across multiple centuries of living at close range with the specific ecology of those mountains. The folk tradition of the Central Appalachians, not the sanitized, commercial version that shows up in tourism materials about Appalachian culture, but the actual, living, practical tradition carried by the older residents of the mountain communities I had occasion to spend time in during 6 seasons of trail work in that area, has specific, detailed, carefully maintained knowledge of the things in those mountains that are not in any wildlife field guide. Knowledge that is not superstition and not folklore in the dismissive sense of that word. Knowledge that is the product of multi-generational close observation of a specific landscape, carried in oral form because oral form is the appropriate vehicle for knowledge that doesn't fit into any institutional category and that the institutions, if they encountered it formally, would not know what to do with. I encountered this knowledge in year 4. Through a connection I made at a small hardware store in the closest valley town to the north end of my section, a place I stopped regularly for supplies, and where I'd gotten to know the owner over several seasons. I mentioned, carefully and in general terms, the voice from the ridgeline, framing it as a question about what he thought produced that kind of sound. He looked at me for a moment and then said, in the specific way of Appalachian mountain men who are deciding whether an outsider is worth the information, "Come back when I close up, and I'll introduce you to someone." The someone was his father-in-law, a man in his 80s who'd grown up in those mountains and whose family had been in the adjacent hollow for 5 generations. He spoke with the careful, unhurried precision of a person who has a lot of specific knowledge and who distributes it with care, because he's learned that most people either can't use it or won't receive it right. He told me about what his grandfather called the Ridge Walkers. Not a casual name, a specific, traditional designation for something that had been in those mountains for as long as his family's oral history went back, which in his telling went back to the early settlement period and likely further, because the stories he'd heard as a child carried older material in them than the settler period accounted for. The Ridge Walkers, in his telling, were not malevolent. He was specific about this. They were not the same thing as what some Appalachian traditions call the Dark Ones, which are a different category of entity with different behaviors and a different relationship to human beings. The Ridge Walkers were old, he said, old in the specific Appalachian sense of something that had been in the mountains before the mountains were what they currently are, before the forest grew up in its current form, before anything that human beings had built or named. They walked the high ridges, and they had their ways and their territories and their habits. And the people who lived in the adjacent valleys had known about them for as long as people had lived in those valleys, and the traditional relationship with them was simple and functional. Give them the ridge after dark, and don't be in the places they use at night, and acknowledge them with the appropriate respect when you encounter evidence of them, and they'll leave you alone. The voice from the ridge at night was them, he said. The specific monotone, repetitive quality I described he confirmed as characteristic. He'd heard versions of it himself over his life, twice on hunting trips in the high country, and his grandfather had heard it many more times. It wasn't language in any sense he could translate. It wasn't directed at human listeners, in his understanding. It was something they did in their territory, and the territory it happened to be in was the territory adjacent to the trail I worked, and it had been happening in that territory for longer than any trail had run through it. I asked him about the figures, the shapes at the edge of visibility. He said yes, that was them too, and that the figures people saw were almost always at a specific kind of distance, far enough that the detail wasn't clear, close enough that the size and the proportion was unmistakable. He said this was not accidental. He said, with the considered certainty of a person who had thought about this for a very long time, they let you see enough to know what you're dealing with. Not more than that. Enough. Enough to know. Not more than that. Enough. I've turned that over many times in the years since. The idea that the scale of the encounters, the distance from which the shapes were visible, the proximity of the voice from the ridge, the child-scaled figures on the trail that couldn't be reached, was calibrated. Chosen. Not accidental, not the product of evasion, but a deliberate choice about how much of themselves to make perceptible to the human beings who moved through their territory. Enough for you to know you were in their space. Not more than that. What that implies about the intelligence behind the encounters is something I've been processing for 6 years since that conversation, and I don't have a complete account of it yet. What I have is the old man's word, offered across a kitchen table in a mountain valley, from a family with 5 generations of direct observation of the same mountains I worked in, carrying knowledge that his grandfather's grandfather carried, delivered with the flat, declarative certainty of facts about the weather or the soil. They let you see enough. They let you hear enough. And then they go back to whatever they do in the ridges at night, with or without the knowledge of any trail club or any wildlife agency or any field guide or any institutional record. Year 4 is also where I need to circle back to the deer, because the deer situation got more complicated in my 4th season, and I've been giving you the simpler version of it. The avoidance of the 12-mile hemlock ridge by deer was the initial observation. What I noticed in year 4 was something more specific within that avoidance pattern, which was that the deer activity at the southern and northern margins of the 12-mile section, the zones where the avoidance pattern began, showed a particular behavior that I'd never seen documented in any deer management literature I was familiar with. At the margins, the deer didn't simply stop using the area and use adjacent areas instead, the way deer distribute themselves around a landscape feature they're avoiding, like a clear-cut or a road or a developed area. At the margins, there was approach behavior. Deer would move to the edge of the avoidance zone, come to a specific point in the terrain that corresponded roughly to where the hemlock density began or the ridge type changed, and stop. And stand, sometimes for what appeared, based on the evidence in the ground, to be extended periods. And then turn around and move back the way they came. I've seen deer approach a feature and stop and assess it. Every deer person has seen that behavior. This wasn't that. The stopping at the margin of the avoidance zone had a different quality, more regular in its geographic distribution along the margin and less associated with any specific terrain feature that would explain the behavioral trigger. It looked less like deer encountering something unexpected and more like deer observing a recognized boundary and turning back at it, the behavior of an animal that knows exactly where a boundary is and respects it with the casual, habitual ease of something long established rather than something encountered for the first time. The deer knew where the 12-mile section began. They knew where it ended. They were operating on information about that piece of territory that was older than any individual deer's experience of it, which means it was learned behavior transmitted across generations in a prey species. That kind of learned, transmitted territorial knowledge in a prey species exists in the scientific literature, but it's associated with specific types of predation pressure over long time periods. It's the kind of knowledge that develops when a predator has been in a territory for long enough, with consistent enough behavioral patterns, that the prey species' behavioral ecology is shaped by it across generations. Something in the northern third of my section had been in that territory for long enough that the local deer population had incorporated it into their generational behavioral inheritance. That implies presence across a timescale that goes well beyond the 40-year incident history in the club's files and well beyond the 80-year trail history of the AT in that section. However long the ridge walkers have been in those mountains, the deer have been calibrating around them for at least that long. Which, if the old man's account of his family's 5-generation knowledge is accurate, is a minimum of several hundred years and is probably much longer. I want to describe Year 5 in more detail because I've given you the children incident but not the fuller picture of what that season contained. Year 5 was the season when I understood, finally, and without the room for argument I'd been leaving myself, that whatever I'd been observing was not one thing. It was a community. I based this on sound. By Year 5, I'd heard the vocal sound from the ridge at the midsection shelter close to a dozen times, always consistent in its basic character, always in the same monotone repetitive register, always from the same ridgeline position. In Year 5, on a night when conditions were unusual, still, clear, cold, the kind of night that carries sound with exceptional clarity, I heard, for the first time, 2 separate sources. 2 voices, from 2 separate positions on the ridge above the shelter, separated by what I estimated as 200 to 300 yards of horizontal distance. Both in the characteristic monotone register, both repeating with the same rhythm. Not together, one would sound for its cycle, and then the other would begin, with an interval between that had a quality of structure to it, as though one completing its iteration was the trigger for the other beginning. Not call and response, because the character of each voice was consistent across multiple iterations without variation. More like a conversation in which both parties are saying the same things, but saying them sequentially rather than simultaneously, with an agreed structure to whose turn it is. I lay in the shelter for close to 2 hours listening to this. The cold kept me from sleeping, and the quality of what I was hearing held my attention more completely than I'd expected, because the 2-source quality was new and the structural relationship between the iterations was cleaner and more organized than anything I'd heard before. I was hearing, for the first time, what sounded like social behavior. 2 individuals, in the same territory, in the same general location on the ridgeline, taking turns at something that they were doing together. Whatever is in those mountains is not alone. It has social structure. It has individuals who share territory and engage in behavior that involves sequential participation, which implies not only intelligence but communication. The same intelligence that produces voices that read as language without being language I can understand is an intelligence that uses those voices socially, with other members of its own kind, in the night above the AT in the Central Appalachians. I've thought about what that means for what the thru-hikers experience when they sleep in those shelters and hear things from the ridge. The thru-hiker experience of the AT sounds is already rich and sometimes alarming to people who haven't spent much time in deep woods at night. The barred owl sound, the coyote vocalizations, the various things that forests produce in the dark. Most thru-hikers file whatever they hear under the category of unfamiliar wildlife and move on. A fraction of them, the ones who are paying close attention and who have enough wildlife experience to know what the standard forest sounds of those mountains are supposed to be, notice something that doesn't fit. Most of those don't report it. A few do, to the shelter registers, to the trail community online, to friends. The accounts circulate in the thru-hiking community as interesting stories from the trail rather than as data. Nobody is collecting them systematically. Nobody except the managing clubs, in their unexplained subcategories, and the old families in the adjacent valleys, in their oral traditions. Both of those repositories exist. Neither of them talks to the other. The trail management system doesn't know about the mountain family traditions, and the mountain families don't interact with the community. The knowledge exists in two parallel systems that have never been compared, and the comparison, if it were made by anyone who had access to both and who understood what they were looking at, would produce a record of this presence in those mountains that went back centuries. I am not that person. What I am is a person who spent 6 years walking those mountains professionally, and who ended up, by curiosity and persistence, and the specific kind of luck that comes from staying in one place long enough to hear what that place has to tell you, with a partial window into both systems. What I saw in both of them was the same thing, a presence, old and persistent and socially organized, that has been in those mountains for longer than the human documentation of those mountains, that the local human communities have integrated into their relationship with the landscape through direct, multi-generational observation, and that continues to be there, on the high hemlock ridges and at the margin where the forest changes character and the wildlife behavior changes with it, doing whatever it does by the terms of its own life in its own territory. The Appalachian Trail is 2,200 miles long. Millions of people walk parts of it every year. A few thousand attempt the through hike in any given season. Of those who walk through the specific section I worked, almost all of them will pass through it in a day or two, focused on their mileage and their next resupply point and the blister on their left heel and the weather system coming in from the west, and they will not notice anything. Or they will notice something and attribute it to wind or wildlife or the general strangeness of a forest at 3 in the morning when you've been walking for 2 weeks and you're tired and scared in the dark. Has a quality that city life doesn't prepare you for. A few will stop when the forest goes quiet. A few will lie in a shelter and hear the voice from the ridge and know, with whatever part of a human being knows things before the conscious mind catches up, that what they're hearing is neither wind nor wildlife nor anything else in their existing categories. A few will see something at the trail's edge in the last light and understand, in the same preconscious way, that what they saw was looking back. For those few, you're not imagining it. You're in territory that is shared with something that has been there for longer than the trail has existed, longer than the European settlement of those mountains, longer than anyone's documented knowledge goes back. It doesn't need anything from you. It's not going to harm you. But it's there, and it knows you're there. And in the morning when the trail is ordinary and the birds are back and the deer are present in the sections on either side of the long hemlock ridge, the ridge where the birds are quieter and the deer stop at the margin and turn around, you're going to walk with a knowledge that most people who've been on that trail don't carry. That knowledge is heavy to carry. It was heavy for 6 years. I've set it down somewhat since I stopped walking those miles, but it never goes away entirely. Some knowledge doesn't. The kind of knowledge that changes what you understand about the world you're moving through. The kind that reveals that the world is larger and older and more densely inhabited than the categories you were given to understand it with have ever captured. That knowledge becomes a permanent alteration to the person who carries it. You can get used to it. You can find ways to live comfortably with it. But you can't go back to not having it. I went back to that section once, 2 years after I left the job. A day hike, late spring, a section of the trail I'd walked hundreds of times, the central part of the section where the character of the trail is warmest and least complicated. I hiked about 10 miles, south to north, and sat on one of the midsection viewpoints for a while and looked at the valley below. The trail was exactly the trail. The views were exactly the views. The birds were working the slope below the viewpoint and the wildflowers were in, and the light was the specific, clear, green-shifted light of an Appalachian spring when the canopy has just leafed out and everything is new. I sat there for a long time, and I was not afraid. I want to be clear about that, because I think the account I've given could be read as the account of someone who was afraid for 6 years and left because of the fear. That's not what happened. What happened was that I worked a piece of landscape for 6 years and came to understand it better than almost anyone outside the adjacent mountain communities. And part of what I understood was that the landscape contained something that the official record of the trail's management had never adequately reckoned with. I left not because I was afraid, but because 6 seasons felt complete, because I'd learned what that section had to teach me, and because the weight of carrying that knowledge professionally, deciding every day what to say and not to say to the hikers I encountered, to the club volunteers, to the search and rescue teams I occasionally coordinated with, had become a burden I was ready to set down. The view from that mid-section viewpoint was worth every one of the more than 2,000 miles I walked to reach it. The trail is worth walking. The mountains are worth knowing. The presence in the northern third of that section is part of what the mountains are, part of what makes them what they are, and the appropriate response to it is not fear and not avoidance, and not the dramatic reaction of someone encountering the supernatural for the first time. It's the response the old man's family had developed over 5 generations: respect. Acknowledgement. The practical wisdom of giving something old and large and established in its own territory the space and the courtesy that its tenure in those mountains has earned. Go carefully. Pay attention to when the forest goes quiet. Don't go up the ridge after the voice starts. And when you come out the other end of the 12-mile section and the deer reappear in the trail ahead of you, and the birds pick back up in the canopy, and the ordinary forest is ordinary again, take a breath and keep walking. You just moved through something's home. Be glad it let you. There are several things I've been leaving out of this account that I want to come back to now, because the omissions are starting to feel like a kind of dishonesty that the rest of the account doesn't deserve. The first is the hikers. In 6 seasons as a ridge runner in that section, I had close to 400 direct interactions with that users, through hikers, section hikers, day hikers, in the shelter log, and the incident log, and my own field notes. Of those 400, I want to tell you about 6 who told me something that I didn't record officially, but that I've kept in my personal notes because it adds to the picture in ways that the incidents I've described from my own observation don't. These were not dramatic accounts. They were brief, almost apologetic disclosures, offered usually at the end of a longer conversation, in the way that people offer information they're not sure will be well received, testing the water with the most anodyne version before committing to more. All 6 had a similar framing. They'd heard something on the trail or seen something that they weren't sure how to describe, and they were asking me, as the professional, the person whose job it was to know this section, whether it was anything they should be concerned about. The sounds they described were consistent with what I documented in my own journal. 3 of the 6 had heard the voice from the ridge, 2 of them at the mid-section shelter, and 1 at a campsite in the northern part of the section. All 3 described it with the same confusion, not words, but organized like words, repeating, low, from above the trail. None of them had been able to sleep well after hearing it. None of them had gone up the ridge to investigate, which I think reflects the same sound judgment that kept me from going up the ridge in year 1. 2 of the 6 had seen things. One was a through hiker who'd seen a figure at the trail's edge on the hemlock ridge that he described as too tall and too still to be a person, observed briefly before it moved behind a tree, and wasn't there when he reached the tree. The other was a section hiker, a retired schoolteacher from Virginia who'd been walking this section annually for 10 years and who had, over those 10 years, had 3 separate experiences that she characterized as seeing something standing near the trail that couldn't have gotten there and couldn't have left in the time available. She was the most matter-of-fact of all the hikers I spoke with about this. 3 times in 10 years, she said, and each time she'd noted it and moved on. Because what else do you do? And she wasn't dead yet, and the trail was still beautiful, and she'd be back next year. She was the one who said something that stayed with me more than anything else I've described in this account except for the old man's phrase about letting you see enough. She said, "I think it's curious. I think it's been curious about the trail since the trail went in. All these people walking through, year after year. I'd be curious too." Curious. Not predatory, not territorial, not protective of something. Curious. The view from the inside of that relationship that I'd always been trying to understand from the outside. And this woman, who'd had 3 direct encounters over a decade of walking the same section, had arrived at curious as her working theory. Something old in the mountains, with its own life and its own purposes, finding the Appalachian Trail and the continuous stream of human beings walking through its territory to be an interesting thing to observe. Coming to the edges of visibility, letting you see enough. Doing its voice from the ridge on the nights when the shelters are occupied. Not because it wants anything from the hikers, because it finds them interesting in the same way that anything intelligent finds an unusual thing in its environment interesting. I don't know if that's right. I've sat with it, and I find it both more and less unsettling than any other framework I've applied to the question of what is producing the phenomena I've described. More unsettling because intelligence directed at you, even benign and non-threatening intelligence, has a quality that is difficult to be entirely comfortable with when the intelligence is this far outside anything you have a reference point for. Less unsettling because curiosity is a motivation I understand, and a motivation that explains the pattern of encounter better than any other I've come up with, present enough to be noticed, distant enough not to frighten, consistent enough across decades to be a real feature of the section's character, and never escalating to anything harmful, because whatever it wants from these observations doesn't require harm. The 6th hiker account is the one I find hardest to describe. It was in year 5, a few weeks before the child incidents, a young man who was doing a solo section hike of about 90 miles starting in the valley to the south and ending in the valley to the north, passing through my section as part of the middle portion of his walk. He was 26, from a Midwestern city, had never done any serious backcountry travel before this trip, which he'd undertaken on a kind of impulse after reading about the ad in a magazine. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of person who should not have had an experience that produced the account he gave me, because he had no prior exposure to deep woods and no reference context for anything unusual and no framework for interpreting what he was describing. He described waking up in the northern shelter at what he thought was around 3 in the morning to the sound of voices. Multiple voices. Not the single monotone voice I'd described and that other hikers had described. Multiple, in what he said sounded like conversation. Not conversation he could understand, not in any language he recognized, but organized in the back-and-forth rhythm of multiple people talking, taking turns, with something that sounded like response and counter-response even though the content was inaccessible to him. He said it had gone on for close to 30 minutes. From the ridge above the shelter, and that by the end of the 30 minutes he had concluded, without any particular evidence, that there were at least 4 or 5 separate voices, possibly more. Multiple voices, multiple individuals, socially engaged, in the territory above the northern shelter. I'd heard 2 in year 5, which was already a revision of my understanding of the scale of what I'd been observing. This young man from a Midwestern city, with no framework for what he was hearing, had counted as many as 5. The difference between 2 and 5 is not trivial. 5 implies a social group of meaningful size, operating in that territory, engaged in behavior complex enough to sound conversational to a person with no prior encounter with anything like this and no reason to interpret it as anything other than what it sounded like. I thanked him for telling me. He asked if I knew what it was. I told him, in the honest answer I could give in that professional context, that I wasn't certain, but that the ridge above the north shelter was known to produce unusual sounds, and that it wasn't anything he needed to be concerned about. He accepted this with the kind of pragmatic equanimity that sometimes, unexpectedly, shows up in people encountering something they have absolutely no reference for, a flatness that is less skepticism and more the cognitive response to an experience so outside the available categories that the normal reaction curves simply don't fire. He said, whatever it was, it didn't bother me. And then he finished his breakfast and packed up and continued north. It didn't bother me, said with the specific calm of a person for whom the appropriate response to the unknowable was not fear, but accommodation. I've thought about that young man many times. Whatever he experienced that night in the northern shelter, hearing what sounded like 5 or more voices in conversation above him on the ridge, he arrived at the right response intuitively, without any of the accumulated knowledge that had taken me 5 years to develop. He lay there and listened and decided it didn't bother him and went to sleep, and in the morning he packed up and walked north. Maybe that's the whole of what you need to know about how to be in that section of the trail. Maybe the complicated framework I've built across 6 years and the old man's 5-generation family tradition and the club's 40-year incident files are all just elaborate constructions around the simple truth that the young man from the Midwest arrived at in one night without any of it. Whatever is up there in the ridges doesn't bother you if you don't let it bother you. You can hear it and acknowledge it and sleep because it doesn't need anything from you except to let it exist in its own territory the way it's existed in that territory for longer than any record goes back. I'll tell you one last thing, and it's a thing I've told nobody until now. In my 6th season, in October, after the hemlock tree incident, on the same final northbound traverse that produced that encounter, I stopped at the midsection shelter for my last overnight in that section before reaching the north end and finishing. My last night in my section, the last night of a 6-year tenure in a specific piece of landscape that had given me more than I'd expected when I took the job and more than I knew what to do with when I left it. Close to 2 in the morning, the same hour, always the same hour, the voice from the ridge began. I lay in my sleeping bag in that shelter and I listened to it for the full duration, close to 5 minutes, the same monotone and the same rhythm and the same organization that I'd been documenting for 6 seasons. And when it stopped, I did something I'd never done before in 6 years of hearing it. I answered. Not with words, with sound, a sustained, low tone at roughly the pitch the voice operated at, held for a few seconds, produced as quietly as I could manage while still being potentially audible at the distance of the ridge above. I don't know what I was communicating or whether communication was even a valid frame for what I was doing. I think I was acknowledging, in whatever form acknowledgement takes when you're an animal at the bottom of a ridge in the dark, saying something in the direction of something you can't see, but that you've been listening to for 6 years. A final acknowledgement before I walked north out of the section and didn't come back. The ridge was silent for close to 2 minutes after I made the sound. And then, from the ridge, very quietly, quieter than the voice usually operated, closer to the limit of my ability to hear it, the voice resumed for perhaps 30 seconds and stopped. I don't know what that means. I don't know if it means anything in any sense that maps onto what meaning means in human communication. What I know is that I lay in that shelter for a long time after it stopped, in the specific silence that follows something you've been waiting 6 years to understand, still not understanding it, but feeling, for the first time, that the not understanding was mutual and that the mutual not understanding had its own kind of completeness. Two things in the same mountains, on either side of a ridge in the dark, acknowledging each other across whatever chasm exists between what they are. For 30 seconds, and then silence. I walked north in the morning. I finished the section. I drove home. I turned in my radio and my keys and my incident log and shook hands with the people at the club who'd employed me and thanked them for 6 seasons, and I drove away from that section of the Central Appalachians. The trail is still there. The Hemlock Ridge is still there. The North Shelter, with its long history of quiet nights and its absence of bear incidents, is still there. Whatever produces the voice from the ridge at 2 in the morning, on the nights when the forest goes silent and the hikers in the shelter lie awake listening, and most of them decide it's something they don't have a category for and roll over and go back to sleep, it's still there. It was there before I arrived. It will be there after the last ridgerunner assigned to that section has finished their last traverse and turned in their keys. It will be there after the trail itself has been reclaimed by the forest. If that ever happens, the blazes fading and the tread disappearing and the Hemlock Ridge returning to the condition it was in before anyone cut a footpath through it. Some things in those mountains are very old. The ridgerunners come and go. The through hikers come and go. The shelter logs fill and are replaced. The managing clubs and the conservancy and the volunteer infrastructure of one of the longest walking trails in the world move through their generations of institutional change. And the voice from the ridge continues, on the right nights, at the right hour, from the right position on the Hemlock Ridge above the midsection shelter. The same voice it was 40 years ago when the first unexplained entry was made in the club's incident files, and the same voice it will be long after every person who currently walks that section is gone. Walk carefully on the Appalachian Trail. Pay attention to when the birds go quiet. Respect the sections where the deer stop at the margin and turn around. And if you're in the northern shelter some October night, and you hear the voice from the ridge at 2 in the morning, be the young man from the Midwest. Lie still. Listen. Let it finish. And in the morning, in the ordinary light, with the ordinary birds and the ordinary trail ahead of you, keep walking north. You were given the courtesy of passage. Honor it. I want to say one more thing about the children, or the things that appear as children, because it's the element of this account that I've handled most carefully, and I think it deserves a more direct treatment than I've given it. The specific choice of child scale and child appearance is not random. I believe that, based on everything I know about what I've been describing. What appears on that trail in the scale and form of a child is not a child, and it is not making an error about what form to take. It is choosing. The choice of child form, small, non-threatening in scale, immediately triggering the specific human concern response that children in wilderness contexts trigger in adults, is a tool. I used the word before in a different context, and I'll use it again here. It's a mechanism. A way of producing a specific response in a specific kind of observer, drawing the observer toward a location, testing how far the observer can be drawn. I don't say this to terrify you. The intent, as best I can determine from the evidence, is not malicious. The testing of how far a human observer can be drawn toward a specific location in specific terrain at a specific hour is the behavior of something trying to understand the organism it's sharing its territory with, using the most effective tool available for producing the response it wants to observe. It is the behavior of something intelligent doing what intelligent things do when they encounter other intelligent things in their environment. They investigate. They test. They watch the response and incorporate it into their understanding. The child you see on the trail ahead of you that doesn't respond when you call, that can't be reached no matter how quickly you move to reach it. Don't follow it off the trail. That's the one practical warning I'll give you directly, as clearly as I know how to say it. Stay on the trail. Call out if you want. But don't follow it off the trail into the timber, and don't follow it in the dark. Not because it will harm you, because you are being studied, and stepping off the trail in pursuit of what you think is a child in distress is the highest possible confirmation of how a specific response is triggered in a human observer. And some part of me, having been in those mountains for 6 years and having thought about this for years afterward, has decided that providing that confirmation is not something I'm comfortable encouraging. Stay on the trail. Keep walking. Come home. That's all of it. That's the full account of 6 seasons as a ridge runner on a section of the Appalachian Trail in the Central Appalachians. I've given you what I observed and what I gathered from others who observed before me, as honestly and as precisely as I know how. Take from it whatever you can use. The trail is worth walking. Walk it. I've been debating whether to name the section. I've decided not to, for reasons that I think should be obvious from everything I've told you. But I want to be honest that the decision is not about protecting anyone's commercial interests or about avoiding embarrassment to the managing club. It's about something else. The section I worked is a specific, real piece of the Appalachian Trail in the Central Appalachians. If I named it, people would go there specifically looking for what I've described. They'd camp in the midsection shelter hoping to hear the voice from the ridge. They'd walk the 12-mile hemlock section specifically looking for figures at the tree line. They'd ask the volunteer trail maintainers pointed questions about the unexplained incident files and make the kind of nuisance of themselves that people make when they go to places with a reputation in the wrong spirit and with the wrong expectations. And the thing is, what's in those mountains is not a tourist attraction. It's not a paranormal destination. It's not a place you go to have a manufactured encounter with the unknown. It's a piece of very old landscape inhabited by something very old that has been coexisting with human activity in its territory for a very long time, including the constant flow of that traffic for close to 100 years. And that coexistence has been functional and non-harmful because the people who've known about the presence have generally responded to it with the appropriate mixture of acknowledgement and respect and practical accommodation. The young man from the Midwest was fine. The retired schoolteacher going back every year for 10 years was fine. Vera, who saw what she saw and decided after 2 seasons that she'd learned what that section had to teach her and moved on to other work, was fine. Phil and the infrastructure volunteer and the old man's family in the valley below are fine and have always been fine. The hikers who hear the voice from the ridge and attribute it to wind and go back to sleep are fine. The ones who hear it and know it isn't wind and lie awake and eventually decide it doesn't bother them and go back to sleep are equally fine. Everyone is fine. Nothing in that section has ever harmed anyone. In 40 years of documented incidents, or, I believe, in the much longer span of the mountain community's knowledge of it. What's there is curious and old and intelligent and present, and the appropriate relationship to it is not fear and not fascination and not the particular kind of excitement that sends people to places with reputations for experiences they want to collect. The appropriate relationship is the one that generations of mountain people have maintained, and that the young man from the Midwest achieved without any preparation at all. Acknowledge it, give it its space, keep moving. So I'm not going to name the section. If you've walked the ad in the Central Appalachians and you recognize what I'm describing from your own experience in a specific section, then you know where it is. If you haven't, the name would just be a destination, and it's not a destination. It's a home. Something's home that existed long before any trail ran through it. And that will continue to be a home long after the last hiker who walked through it has come in from the trail and told their story to whoever was waiting for them. Walk the trail. It's worth every mile. And listen when the forest goes quiet.